One other thing I forgot to mention, I am going to be strict about documentation for missed exams, especially if you're letting me know like right before the exam or right after. Now look, I know stuff happens. People get hit by a bus, whatever, stuff happens. But I need some kind of documentation saying, hey, I'm not feeling well, can I do it later? That's not going to cut it. In a class this big, I can't really take your word for it. There's over 300 people here, and statistically, that means that around 3 of you are psychopaths. And I don't know which, you probably know who you are, but I don't know which of you it is. So I need some kind of documentation. If you let me know long in advance, like a few of you have come to me saying you're on the track team or something, okay, it's unlikely you make that up that far in advance, so I'll be more sympathetic to that. But if you say something right before the exam, if you have no documentation, I'm not probably gonna take your word for it. Quick funny story about that though. One thing I don't want you to do, that apparently one of my instructors had to deal with. So an instructor that I had in undergrad named Brian Nadeau, he had a very masculine voice, and he gave a similar spiel to the one I just gave, saying that you need documentation. But then he said that, around midterms, grandmas just drop like flies. And midterms, everyone's grandma's dead. And so one year I decided, look, I need some documentation. So after giving the spiel, I went to my office and I got this note from security saying that a package had arrived for me that was too large for my mailbox. Some of you know where this is going. So I went to security, and there's grandma's ashes waiting for me. Please don't do that. Just a death certificate is fine or something like that. Another thing that I'm going to say, a few people mentioned this. Don't pack up during a video. You may have thought it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but last time during the last video, even I found it kind of hard to hear it, and I've seen the video before. So the extra 30 seconds is not going to destroy your college career if you are late to the next class. So if a class happens to end with a video, just wait till the video's over to start packing up. Speaking of video clips, in the video that I post on eClass or on YouTube and then link to on eClass, as some of you may have noticed, the video clips will be removed. So you have to be in class to see those. The reason I do that is YouTube is often strict about removing things that break copyright, and I don't know who's going to complain or not, so it's just easier just to remove the YouTube clips. And as I sort of joked about at the beginning, I know that the audio quality was not great on the first video, so I'm using my new iPhone. Hopefully it's better. I tested it out before and it does seem to be significantly better, so hopefully you can hear it. There was CC, closed captions, included on the last video, but I skimmed through it earlier to kind of see if there were some things I could fix. And now that's going to take a few hours for that to get integrated. So if you don't see CC today, it should be back up soon. Oh yeah, and then last piece of housekeeping before we get back into content. As you guys should have seen on announcements, the 8th edition of the book is available on eClass, or sorry, in the bookstore. So that's the best one to get. If you get a 6th or 7th edition, it probably won't matter, but if you want to be really safe, I'd recommend getting the 8th edition. Okay. Before we jump back into content, any questions about anything I've said? Yes? Here's what I'll say about that. Someone asked about that on eClass. Most of the test will come from things that are both in the lecture and in the textbook. Most of it will be overlap. However, the book and the lecture are testable. There will be a few things in lecture that aren't in the book. I'll usually make a point of saying when that is. And there will be a few things in the test that come from the book that aren't in lecture. I would say that when you're reading the book, let the key terms guide what you focus on, that list of key terms. Like I said before, if you know those key terms, you should be fine. And I'm not necessarily going to define every single one in lecture. I'll try to cover most of them. So yes, everything in the book and lecture is testable, but let the key terms guide what you focus on. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, let's get back into it. So I finished last Tuesday's lecture with a discussion of basic and applied research. And I want to say one more thing about that because several people asked me the same question about it. So just to refresh your memory, basic research means that the research is not done for any concrete, practical reason. It's just done because you want to understand the world or figure something out. Whereas applied research is done for some kind of concrete, practical benefit. And many of you ask me, well, is the point of basic research that in the long run it leads to concrete applied benefits? To those of you streaming late, please try to come on time. Like, it is a little bit disruptive. So some of you asked that. And my answer there is, that is one of the benefits of doing basic research. That was the whole point of the Neil deGrasse Tyson video, right? That research that in the short term doesn't seem to have any practical benefit often does lead to benefits in the long term. But I want to be clear, that's not the only reason we do basic research. I mean, I'll use my own research as an example. I've done work in a few areas, but my main area is what's called moral psychology. So I scan people's brains while they read moral dilemmas. I try to correlate their reactions to moral dilemmas with other psychological measurements. And if you ask me, why am I doing that? My honest answer is, I find it interesting. I want to know how the mind works. There may be an applied consequence of it down the road, or there may not be. But whether or not there is, that's not the only reason to do basic research. So hopefully that helps. Okay, and I put up this comic. I forgot to show it yesterday. It's a beautiful example or illustration of confirmation bias. So this guy, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research into the real truth. Literally the first link that agrees with whatever you already believe, jackpot. And if we are honest with ourselves, we all do that to some degree. Yeah, I'll let people find their seats. Okay. So as I say, please try to be on time. I know it's only the second day, you guys are getting used to things, but given how big the class is, it's also an issue because people have to rummage through and find seats. So please, even though there's no longer iClicker, please try to be on time. I'll quickly say that when I was in middle school, my teacher instituted a punishment for people who were late, which is if you were late, the whole class could point at the person who was late and go, late! I probably won't do that. I'll probably get in trouble if I do that, but that's probably the only threat I could give. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the book. I'm going to discuss the concept of levels of analysis. This is a testable concept. Psychology is a very interdisciplinary field. And what I mean by that is it takes advantage of the methods and resources of different approaches and different sciences. There are, please put your phone on Do Not Disturb. The three main levels of analysis that you should know are the biological level of analysis, the psychological level of analysis, and the environmental level of analysis. Okay. So let's move through these in order. So if you are approaching a psychological problem from the biological level of analysis, you are interested in the bodily underpinnings of various psychological capacities. So I'll just use depression again because it's an easy example to talk about. If you're studying depression from the biological or with the biological level of analysis, you would ask questions like, do depressed people have different levels of neurotransmitters? Is there a genetic basis for depression or something like that? And we'll be talking about many of those in chapters 3 and 4. If you are approaching it at the psychological level of analysis, the vocabulary you will use is not neurotransmitters or genes or things like that. It will be beliefs, desires, terms like that. So for example, one very thriving area of research into depression is research into the ways in which depressed people have different sorts of beliefs, right? Different sorts of reasoning processes. There's a lot of evidence that depressed people tend to think irrationally. So, someone gets fired and they say to themselves, oh, I will never get hired again. I'm a complete failure. No one likes me. They'll tell themselves things like this. And that's kind of an overreaction, right? That's not a very rational way of approaching just getting fired once. But that would be a psychological way of explaining why someone is depressed, right? What are their thinking patterns? And then lastly, the environmental level of analysis would be about things in people's environment. So what kind of family were they raised in? Did they have some kind of childhood adversity? Or even something as trivial as, how hot is it outside? There's evidence that when it's hotter outside, people are more aggressive, for example. All of that would fall under the purview of the environmental level of analysis. Okay. So now we are going to review a bit of the history of psychology. So before, though, we get into the history of psychology, we technically have to look at the history of philosophy first, just a little bit. The reason for this is all sciences, or certainly most of the sciences, start out as philosophy. Do any of you know what the degree PhD stands for? Does anyone know? Philosophical doctorate, exactly. So all of your professors will either be PhD students like me, or they will have completed their PhD. At least they should have. And as this gentleman correctly says, it stands for philosophy doctorate. The reason for this is the sciences all started out as philosophy. So Isaac Newton, for example, if you had asked Isaac Newton, are you a philosopher or are you a scientist, he would not have understood the question. Back in those days, physics was just called natural philosophy. So an intellectual subject will usually start out in philosophy, but then when the subject grows up to be a big boy, he moves out of mom's house. Mom's house is like philosophy, but then once he's a big boy, he becomes his own science. So that happened to psychology in the 1800s, but I will say a little bit about some of the philosophical background of psychology. Because before psychology grew up and became a science, it was philosophers who asked questions about the mind. One early view in the history of at least modern philosophy is mind-body dualism. This is in the book and it is testable. I may sometimes just call it dualism. So if I say dualism, I'm referring to this kind of dualism. But it's helpful to first associate it with mind-body. So dualism means two things. So unsurprisingly, mind-body dualism means that the mind and body are two separate things. Very important concept. This goes back to a philosopher named René Descartes, who is a Frenchman. And I mean, it has precursors in ancient Greece as well, but Descartes was the person who formalized the idea of mind-body dualism. And so the idea here is that there are two kinds of things: physical things and non-physical things. So physical things would be like rocks, atoms, brains, anything like that. Those are all physical things. But there are also non-physical things. So, if you believe in God, presumably God would be a non-physical thing. And for Descartes, the mind. The mind is also a spiritual, metaphysical, whatever. It's not a physical thing. It interacts with the body. That was Descartes' view. So the body's here and the mind's here and they interact. And by mind, Descartes does not mean the brain. The brain is included in the body part. That's a physical thing. The mind is this invisible thing that is connected somehow to the body and causes it to do things. And if you believe in an afterlife, presumably the mind is the part that survives death and lives on. So that's an important view. The other view, the competing view, is monism. There's different words for this. Technically, there's other types of monism, but when I say monism in this class, what I really mean is materialism. That's the kind of monism that we will be referring to. Materialism meaning not like you're greedy, not that sense of materialism, but only material things exist. It's all just atoms in the void, as the Epicureans would say. So it's just atoms bumping around, including us. Right? So if you're a materialist, the mind and the body are not two different things. The mind is just what the brain does. Whenever you think or feel an emotion or have a memory or whatever, that's just your brain doing stuff. There's no separate mind or soul or anything like that. And most psychologists would either be monists or they at least act like monists when they're in the lab. Many psychologists are religious. One example would be William James, who we'll talk about today. But even ones who are religious, when they write psychology research papers, they tend not to say things like, the invisible soul moves the atoms in the brain. Like they don't say that sort of thing. So monism is kind of a good working hypothesis. It's the one that typically is presupposed by research papers in psychology. To say a little bit more about the difference between monism and dualism, I'm going to show a quick clip from Sean Carroll. So very well put by Sean Carroll. So that should give you a sense of why many people in science are inclined to at least provisionally accept something like monism. Now, I don't want to sell Descartes short, though. So there he made reference to René Descartes, who formalized the idea of mind-body dualism. Some people, where is my marker? Okay, I'll get another one. Some people talk about Descartes as if he was so dumb that he couldn't tie his shoes, but Descartes was a very smart man. He actually invented this. So in mathematics, like the coordinate system where things are located in a two-dimensional space, Descartes invented that. So not a dumb fella. And for whatever it's worth, we will be returning to the subject of dualism and monism in chapter 6, where we will see probably the biggest contemporary challenge to monism or materialism. But that's just an introduction to at least the difference between those two views. Any questions on what these two things mean? Yes?
For monism, the Elizabeth person that was mentioned in the video,
I don't remember if she actually was a monist. I don't think she would have been quite that explicit about it. She was just challenging Descartes' particular version of it. And actually, you guys don't need to know Elizabeth of Bohemia. She's an interesting historical figure. She did kind of get the better of Descartes in her debates with him. But I don't think she would have been a monist. But she definitely rejected, This is off, right? You guys can't hear me?
Yeah.
It's on?
It's
It's off, okay. I will just have to speak loudly. Oh, I see what's going on. Oh yeah. Yeah, what happened is the people in the back, you still hear me if I talk like this? Okay. I'll just talk loudly until this boots back up. What was I saying? Elizabeth of Bohemia. Anyways, so you don't need to know Elizabeth of Bohemia. You should just know the difference between these two views. Okay, another pair of views that you should know is rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is not in the book, but the opposite, empiricism is. Opposite is probably too strong, but the conflicting view. Not emphacism, empiricism. So rationalism and empiricism. So here's the distinction. You guys may remember the term empirical from last class. Empirical means based on observation. As you might be able to guess, the empiricists said we should only believe things for which we have empirical evidence. In other words, you cannot figure out what's true Okay, is the mic back on? Okay, great. Okay, good. Let's put on this. Okay, so the projector should take a minute to kick back up, but I don't need it yet. So anyways, the empiricists said you should only believe things that you can test or observe. You should not use pure thought. You can't just sit down in your chair and think about things to figure out what's true. As you might be able to guess, the rationalists disagreed with this. They agreed that some things you need evidence for, but they said, no, there are other things that you can know simply by thinking about it. The rationalists believe that rational thought, or just pure thought and reasoning, could guide you to certain truths about the world. The book calls it British empiricism. Don't worry about the fact that it's called British empiricism. It's just called that in the book because these ideas were formalized in England and Scotland, so people like John Locke, David Hume. David Hume is better, by the way, just in case you're wondering, but that doesn't matter. The fact that it's British is of no consequence. The book also has a discussion of psychophysics. Don't worry about that. That's going to come more in a later chapter. It's an early experimental precursor to psychology, but I'm not going to test you on that for the first test. Oh, yes?
So does something like religion exist in empiricism?
You can be an empiricist and religious. One of the most important empiricists was someone named George Berkeley, who was actually a bishop. So there's no contradiction between empiricism and religion. And actually, for that matter, there's no contradiction between being a monist, at least a monist about humans, and being religious. There are some religious philosophers who don't believe in a soul, but believe the afterlife is just bodily resurrection, because they think that human beings don't have a soul. So that's the only way you can get one. I suspect that empiricists are more likely to not be religious, but there's no necessary contradiction. Does that help?
I'm not asking if you can be an empiricist and religious. I'm asking if religion, the concept of religion itself exists in empiricism.
No, so if I understand your question, the definition of empiricism includes no mention of religion. All empiricism says is you should only believe things for which there is observational evidence. That's all. So I didn't say the word religion. There's no religion in the definition of it, but there's no necessary connection or contradiction one way or another. You could be religious and be an empiricist or not. Okay, so that's that. Okay, let's move on. So these are all various philosophical sort of precursors to the origin of psychology. But psychology grew up, or at least moved out of Mom's house, in 1879, when Wilhelm Wundt, German fella, set up the first psychology lab, at least the first official psychology lab. So as I say, he was a German fella, and he did very systematic experimentation on human psychology. The view that, or the perspective that Wundt started, came to be known as structuralism. This is another reason it's good to bring the book to class. You can follow along, because I basically just go in the order that the book goes, and then you can double check my spelling. So structuralism. So Wundt thought that psychology should model itself after chemistry. That the way to study the mind is to use the same methods that the chemists used for physical things. So pay attention, well, first of all, let me say, the way chemistry works is you break things down into their smallest component parts. So, I don't know, take like this book. So if a chemist was thinking about this book, he or she would ask, what is it made of? And I don't really know much about books, but presumably hydrocarbons from trees and stuff like that. So you can break that down further until eventually you get to the periodic table of elements, right? That's the sort of the building blocks for chemistry. And Wundt thought we should do the same thing for the mind. Wundt thought that the way to analyze the mind is to ask yourself, what is it made of? What is it made, or what is its structure, you could say? So, pay attention right now to your experience. So right now, presumably you are all conscious. I may have lost a few of you, but hopefully most of you are conscious. So you have various sights, right? You can see colors and shapes and things like that. You're hearing the sound of my voice. You might feel pressure on the shitty chairs that are in this room. So all of those are experiences that you're having. And Wundt thought that you could break those down into smaller parts. So something like a particular shade of red. That would be like a mental element. So we thought you could have like a periodic table of mental elements. So like a particular sound, particular shade of red, particular feeling. These could all be like mental elements. So that was what he thought the most promising method would be for looking at the mind. And to be more specific, another method that he used is introspection. He thought introspection was very important. Introspection, as it's an ordinary language term and has roughly the same meaning for Wundt, it means you look into your own mind. You systematically kind of introspect, right? You look inwards and analyze the experiences that you have. So that was an important method that Wundt used. Yes?
So like meditating is kind of like self-reflection?
Meditating is not that far off, but the goal is not inner peace or something. The goal is to understand the elements that make up conscious experience. But yes, it's sort of similar to meditation. You can call it scientific meditation, with the aim of, as I said, understanding what the mental elements are. Okay, any questions about Wundt? Yes? No, there are no structuralists today. This is an old perspective. So the first few perspectives I'm talking about, especially James and Wundt, they've influenced contemporary psychologists, but these are not popular perspectives today. I don't know of any psychologist today who would say, oh yeah, so I'm a structuralist. There really aren't any. This is more just for historical reasons. Any other questions? Yes?
When did he establish it?
1879.
Oh, that's That's pretty recent for like a science.
Psychology is a young science, and it shows.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Don't tell my supervisor I said that. Okay, so the next big perspective, another W name, which is too bad. William James. William James established a different perspective, which was functionalism. Again, this is a historical perspective. It's somewhat similar to a contemporary perspective called evolutionary psychology, but strictly speaking, it's a different perspective. So James was, as I sort of implied, profoundly influenced by Charles Darwin. Although, as I say, funny enough, he was actually a devout Christian, wrote a lot about theology and philosophy of religion as well, but he was influenced by Darwin. And so he thought that Wundt had the wrong idea, and that the right question to ask when analyzing the mind is not what is it made of, but what is it for? What is it for? Or you could say, what is its function? What's the point of having a mind? And for James, the point of having a mind, if you think about it in evolutionary terms, the point of having a mind is to have the capacity to guide your behavior intelligently. Right? We sometimes forget this. We think, oh yeah, the point of having a brain is to sit down and think really cool thoughts or something. But in evolutionary terms, the point of having a brain is to be able to, guide your behavior. There's a reason trees don't have brains. It wouldn't do them any good. They can't move. Not really. They would just sit there and think about stuff, but it would have no behavioral consequence, and therefore it would not contribute to their survival and reproduction. There's no point in having a brain if you can't move, right? So the whole point of having a brain for James, and I think this insight is right, is to guide behavior. So that's the functionalist perspective. You don't need to know too many details about that. You should just know basically what I just said, just like the rough overview. There's a podcast I listen to called Very Bad Wizards, which I strongly recommend if you're interested in psychology. They once read James's book, Principles of Psychology, as part of the podcast, and they had to admit, a lot of this is still cutting edge, which is kind of sad, as this gentleman asked, isn't psychology quite young? And as I say, it shows. But James was a very smart man, way ahead of his time. Okay, now we have to talk about Freud. How many of you have heard of Sigmund Freud? Right, so very famous, probably the most famous psychologist who has ever lived, and there's probably not a close second. As I said, when I came into psych, he was the only guy that I knew. So Freud is an interesting character for many reasons. How do I start this off? So he had a lot of good insight, and the central insight that he had was that we have to talk about unconscious mental processes. Before Freud, it was largely taken for granted that if something is in the mind, it has to be conscious, almost by definition. Before Freud, that was just taken for granted. But Freud argued, I forgot to show these, but whatever it's worth, that's Wundt, and that's James. And you might say they look exactly the same, and you'd be right. This is Freud. So, sorry, I'll put this back. So, what was I saying? So Freud was the first one to argue in a systematic way that we have to talk about unconscious mental processing. And that insight, virtually all psychologists accept today. Virtually all psychologists accept that much of our thinking occurs unconsciously. However, many of the details of Freud's theories are completely crazy, and virtually no one thinks that. It's hard to know where to begin, but for example, Freud thought that young boys all were sexually attracted to their mother and were all afraid that their father would cut their penis off. I have no idea what to do with that. There's not the slightest evidence that that's true. Freud did a lot of cocaine, so that could be part of it. Guys, I'm pretty sure young boys are, So the way I think about Freud is this. There's sort of two different skill sets that you need to be a good scientist, because science is basically a two-step process. I mentioned the name Karl Popper yesterday. Popper argued that science is essentially a process of conjecture and refutation. This isn't testable. This is just a little piece of insight maybe into how Freud thinks. So conjecturing is when you guess. Like Feynman said, right? You guess. Now, guessing kind of requires creativity. Some people who are too rational are not very good scientists, because to guess, you kind of have to make shit up. You have to just, take a guess, take a conjecture. But then step two is you try to refute your guess. You try to prove your guess wrong, and then you keep the guess if it survives your attempt to prove it wrong. Freud was really good at the first part. He could make up all kinds of crazy shit. Yes?
I just have a question about unconsciousness. Is there a difference between our subconscious mind and our unconscious mind, or is it the same thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some textbooks, they draw a kind of strange distinction between the two. Not in this class. Don't worry about the difference between those. Good question. But anyways, I was just going to say that so Freud was good at this. He could make ideas up, very creative man, and very smart. I don't want to trash him too much. He was not so good at rigorously testing his ideas. So that's kind of the trade-off. Some people have different kinds of skill sets there. So we don't need to go into too much detail about Freud. I'll mention a few things, though, just to give you a sense of how the man thought. Freud's therapeutic technique was called psychoanalysis. So if any of you seen in the movies when someone's laying on a couch and there's like a therapist behind them writing notes? Show of hands if you've seen that in a movie. So that almost never happens today unless you're seeing a Freudian. Most therapists just sit in front. Like the couch thing is really old-fashioned, but if you see that, that's psychoanalysis. Apologies for the. I'll just erase. So that's psychoanalysis, with the goal being to get at the unconscious conflict. Freud thought that conflict drove a lot of mental disorders, that there was conflict between different unconscious forces, and then you had to kind of get to the bottom of those in order to cure different types of psychopathology. Again, we're not going to go into all of the detail. In 105, I'll be talking more about this, but one thing Freud would do is have patients engage in free association. So free association is just when you're laying on the couch, you're instructed to free associate, and you'll just say whatever comes to your head, wherever you find yourself going. So, okay, the projector's on. That reminds me of my grade 2 class when we had a different kind of projector. That's when I found out I needed. You just keep going. Just whatever comes into your head, and you're supposed to just let it all out. And the analyst will try to discover themes or patterns that might serve as evidence for what's going on in your unconscious. One other thing I'll mention, Freud thought that the human personality consisted of essentially 3 parts: the ego, the superego, and the id. So the id is raw animal desire, so desire for food, for sex, for dominance, whatever. The superego is your conscience, so whatever you were kind of taught to believe or taught to think is wrong. And then the ego is the you. Ego, in fact, in German, the German word that's translated ego just means I. So really it's the I and the super I. So the ego is you, and the ego has to negotiate between these two conflicting processes. So, whatever. You see the chocolate cake, and you really want it, and the id's like, yes, take the chocolate cake. The super ego's like, no, you should abide by society's standards and be in better shape. And the ego has to decide. I can think of other examples, but I'll keep my job. We'll just stick with that example. Okay. Last thing I'll say about Freud, and it relates to the idea of conjecture and refutation. So I said last class that it's very important that a theory be falsifiable, right? That a theory be able to be proven wrong. Probably the biggest problem with Freud, and as I've said, there's several, but the biggest problem is Freud's theories had built-in mechanisms for avoiding refutation. So Freud's theory is widely thought to be unfalsifiable. Just as an example, so I mentioned that young boys, according to Freud, hate their father because they're afraid of something. And now, if you say to Freud, well, look at Johnny over there. He's hugging his father. Doesn't that mean he likes his father? And Freud would say, no, that's reaction formation. He's showing the opposite emotion of what he really feels, which is one of Freud's ideas. You say, okay, well, this boy is hitting his father. No, that means he hates his father. Okay, this boy's just ignoring his father. Doesn't give a crap, he's just playing with blocks. That's sublimation. He's taking his hatred for his father and redirecting it into the blocks. You see the problem, right? No matter what the experiment shows, it somehow proves that Freud is right, which means, of course, that it's unfalsifiable. Okay. Say again, sir? If he hit his father a lot? Oh, Freud? Maybe. I don't know about Freud's relationship with his father. I do know he had a very young mother. Maybe that explains some of his kooky ideas. I'm just kidding. Maybe that's enough Freud for one day. Oh, actually, I lied. I have one quick thing I want to show. So one phrase in the popular imagination is a Freudian slip. How many of you have heard of a Freudian slip? Not too many of you. So the idea here is, how sometimes people accidentally say something really weird, but it seems to give insight into what they're really thinking? Freud would say that's the unconscious, kind of accidentally letting something out. I'll show a quick clip of a compilation of Freudian slips. These are from politicians. I'm not making any political point with this. There's people on the left and the right here. But it's a good illustration of a kind of popular way in which Freud's ideas have come into the public imagination.
Basically when the intrusive thoughts win, I guess?
Sorry?
Basically when the intrusive thoughts win.
Intrusive thought wins, yes, that's one way of saying it. I'll stop it there, because if I show the other ones, I might lose my job. So now we really are done with Freud. So let's move on, and we'll move on to the behaviorists. So the behaviorists were a reaction against the views that came before. The behaviorists came along and said, so before the behaviors you have, Wundt talking about introspection and looking into your own mind. You have Freud talking about all kinds of craziness. And the behaviorists were kind of a pendulum swing. They said, what the hell are you guys talking about? Id, ego, introspection, mental elements, that's all a bunch of nonsense. In science, we don't want to be making shit up. We want to stick to what we can directly observe. The behaviorists were, you could say, really extreme empiricists. Like, stick really closely to the hard facts. Don't go off into la-la land. Stick to the hard facts. The behaviorist perspective essentially boils down to three basic ideas. These are the textbook doesn't list them together, but it's worth writing these down. So number one is only study behavior. obviously that's where the term behaviorist comes from. So the reason for this is they said, look, you can't see people's thoughts or emotions or beliefs. You can't see what's going on in people's heads. All you can see is their behavior, what they do, what they say, how they move, that's all stuff that you can directly observe. So that's what we should be studying. Don't worry about unconscious this and conscious that and mental elements. Forget all that. Number 2, humans are blank slates. So, I don't know if I've mentioned the term nature-nurture debate yet. The nature-nurture debate is about whether or not human differences emerge from genetics, like from our nature, or from the environment. So, blank slate means like blank sheet of paper on which the environment writes. So, according to the behaviorists, humans are born into the world without any strong inclinations one way or another. So you may have heard people say humans are naturally evil or naturally good, or some say naturally selfish, whatever. The behaviorists would say, nonsense. Humans are not naturally anything. We are whatever the environment shapes us to be. So they are 100% on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. Relatedly, number 3, the way in which the environment shapes us is through different kinds of conditioning. In particular, and we won't talk about this in detail now, we'll talk about this more in chapter 7, but the 2 kinds of conditioning that they talked a lot about are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical and operant. So, I'll start with classical. Operant, I will say only a tiny bit about. So, before the behaviorists came on the scene, there was a gentleman named Ivan Pavlov. That's not either of these guys, but you still should know Ivan's name. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. He was studying dog saliva. Now, if there was ever a question that was basic research, that's it. Who gives a shit about dog saliva? Well, Pavlov did. So he was studying the pattern of salivation of dogs in response to seeing food. And he discovered that the dogs would start salivating before he even entered the room. Before the food was ready. They would start salivating when he entered the room. They sort of learned by association what things were cues to the food was coming. So he decided to test this experimentally. He would ring a bell, give the dog food. Ring a bell, give the dog food. And eventually the dog would start salivating just to the sound of a bell. Right? Just kind of by association. That's a great example of classical conditioning. Just kind of learning by association. This is associated with this, and reacting as a result. Okay, so that's classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is, oh yes sir.
Sorry, I was curious. Is there a way to unlearn conditioning?
Absolutely, yes. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking about that in chapter 7, and also in chapter 17. There's a chapter on therapy in 105, so that's not this semester, but yes, there absolutely is.
Sorry, could you just define classical conditioning again?
All I think you need to know for I think of a long definition. The short definition is, I would say, learning by association. Just associating things together. That's good enough for chapter 1. Chapter 7, I'll be expecting more. Operant conditioning is essentially reward and punishment. So it's not about association in the same sense that classical conditioning is. It's about voluntary behavior that is then rewarded or punished. And Skinner and Watson, I should say who these gentlemen are. So John Watson started the school of behaviorism, and then B.F. Skinner, who's the other guy, took it to the next level. And during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, behaviorism dominated psychology. It fell out of favor in the 60s for reasons I'll talk about later, but during that kind of the middle of the 20th century, these guys reigned supreme. So those are the core sorts of stances taken by the behaviorists. There's a quote in the book that is essentially obligatory for me to quote. It's quoted in almost every intro psych class. This is from John Watson, not the Sherlock character, but the behaviorist. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specialized world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee you to take any one of them at random and train him to become any type of specialist that I select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant thief, and yes, even beggarman and thief. Regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, or race of his ancestors. In other words, blank slate, right? Whatever the environment does to you, that's what determines who you are. Okay, so as I say, this is not a super popular position nowadays, but with regard to step 3, these two processes absolutely are real, and they have wide-ranging applications that we will be talking about in chapter 7. But I'll quickly show one more video clip, probably the last one of today. The class is not over, do not pack your bags. But a little clip from The Office of Jim using classical conditioning on detectives. Okay. So, that's probably good enough for the behaviorists. On page 16, you will see the term cognitive behaviorism. Cross that out. Don't worry about it. That's just going to confuse you, I think. You will not be tested on that. Okay, next perspective. So chapter 1, in a lot of ways, is, you can think of it as a pond that's kind of broad but shallow, because you have to cover kind of lots of different perspectives without getting into depth. So my apologies for that. So the next perspective is the humanist perspective, or humanistic perspective. So the humanistic perspective, you can think of as being, these are real positive guys. They have a very optimistic vision of human nature and of human possibility. They thought that behaviorism and Freudian theories, although very different, they were similar in that they were both kind of depressing. So the humanists were a more upbeat bunch. One crucial view that they rejected, but you should know this term, this could be on the test, is determinism. So determinism, which is a view that, again, the humanists rejected, determinism is the view that everything that happens is determined by prior causes. This is a view that is widely held in the sciences, although quantum theory presents certain problems for this view, but many in the scientific, with a scientific worldview have held to this, and the view is that whatever happens, there is a set of causally sufficient conditions that led to it. So to make it concrete, in the case of human behavior, if you're a determinist, then you believe that it's possible, at least in principle, to scan my brain and scan all the atoms in this room and predict what I'll do next. If you knew where all the atoms were in my brain and you know the laws of physics, you could predict what I'll do next. And it's all just clockwork. It's all just causes preceding effects. I'll just mention in passing, for anyone who rejects determinism, there's an experiment that should make people nervous. It doesn't prove determinism, but believe it or not, psychologists have done several studies where they give people two simple choices, like a black button and a red button. You're sitting in front of them, and you're told, take as much time as you like. Choose the black button or the red button. And while doing this, there's two things going on. There's a clock in front of you, which you're supposed to watch and remember the moment when you made a decision. So, okay, the hand, yep, I've decided the black button. And then you push the black button. Also, your brain is being scanned at the same time. And neuroscientists analyze the data. Neuroscientists can predict which one you're going to pick, depending on the study, 5 to 10 seconds before you've made the decision. Kind of a spooky finding. And when I say predict, I don't mean with 100% certainty. Neuroscience is not advanced enough for that, but that's the kind of thing a determinist might point to. You will not be tested on that experiment. What you should know is the humanists rejected this. The humanists say no, determinism is not true. We have free will. We can self-actualize, we can become whatever we want to be. Because like I said, they were very, very optimistic chaps. So they believed in free will, and they believed that we should be striving to help people reach self-actualization, which means achieving your unique potential. This influenced how they did therapy. So Freudians, when they do therapy or analysis, they view people as depraved patients who need serious help. That's true. The humanists viewed, they didn't even call them patients. They would call them clients. A therapist is just there to kind of help you out, right? Help you achieve your unique potential. Not there to sit over you like an expert and tell it like it is. So that's a little bit about the humanists. We go into their work in more detail in the therapy chapter in 105, but that's probably good enough for our purposes. Oh, sorry. Any questions about the behaviorists? Or sorry, the humanists before I move on? Yes.
The theory of rejecting determinism, from a psychological standpoint, you can accept that, right? But from a sociological, because we view that one, sociology is the study of the group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, in that instance, we can't reject determinism, right?
Oh, sure you could. I mean, you could be a sociologist and reject determinism. No reason why you shouldn't. So there's a few other questions. Yes.
So would like the thought experiment of like Maxwell's demon be like the
Oh, I think Laplace's demon, but yes.
Laplace's demon
Yeah.
be basically determinism?
Yes.
Okay.
So those of you who don't know, yes, Laplace's thought experiment, Laplace's demon, is the idea of a being with unlimited computational power who knows all the laws of physics. So if a being had a giant computer, knew all the laws of physics, it could predict what will happen with 100% confidence. As I say, there's actually a big problem with that from quantum theory, which seems to have genuine randomness built into it, but don't worry about that. This is not a physics class, and I'm not a physicist. I saw one other hand. No? Okay. Oh yes, sorry.
Can you go over self-actualization again?
Yeah, self-actualization is just achieving your unique potential. So if you're like a really good painter, becoming the best painter you can be, and as fulfilled as you can be in your painting, whatever. Okay, last question and last one.
I'm just curious, how accurate was that study on determinism? Like, do you know the percentage?
That's a great question. I want to say like 70. So I'd have to double check. So the first ones were done by Benjamin Libet. There's a couple of good replications by someone named Soon, I think. But yeah, don't quote me on the details, but Libet is the first study. But you will not be tested on that. Okay, I was hoping to finish the chapter today. I am skeptical that, in fact, I'm actually quite confident that will not happen. So one thing that's nice about having the exam review days is they can be a little bit of a cushion, right? So if the schedule gets pushed up a bit, we can spend like the first 10, 20 minutes of the exam review day finishing anything that I don't get around to. So that may happen. We'll still go in order, so it'll probably mean that like the end of chapter 2, I'll have to finish during exam review day, but that should be fine. Okay, the next perspective we're going to talk about is the cognitive perspective. cognitive means basically thinking or computation, something like that. Or the kinds of thinking that are akin to computation, you could say. So think back to the behaviorists for a second. So the behaviorists said, among other things, we should only study behavior. Don't worry about what's going on in people's heads. As I said, this was the dominant school until about the 50s. In the 50s, there was something called the cognitive revolution. 50s and arguably 60s. In the cognitive revolution, it became acceptable again to talk about what goes on in the mind. There are several reasons for this, but one crucial reason why the cognitive revolution happened when it happened is computers. The cognitive revolution depends a lot on an analogy between human thinking in the brain and computers. And here's roughly how it works. So here's this laptop here. I have no idea how this works. Like, not really. I mean, I know there's a CPU. I think that's important. That's really the extent of my knowledge. I don't know, have any of you seen the Avengers movies? I assume most of you have. In that early one, there's a scene when Captain America, who I think of as my spirit animal in many ways, is trying to fix something, and he's asking Iron Man for help. And it's like a machine, and he says, it appears to run on some form of electricity. That's how much I know about how the computer works. But at a higher level of analysis, I do know how the computer works. I can open up Microsoft Word, and I know how to use it at the level of, the programs. It's possible to know about computer code and computer programs and how they work without knowing very much about the physiology, right? You don't need to know how the transistors work to use Microsoft Word. The cognitive psychologist said similarly that we can know about thinking patterns and how humans process information without knowing the details of what the hippocampus is doing or something. So one important cognitive psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus, for example, did a lot of work on how memory works. And you don't need to know that example, it's just to illustrate. She figured out how memory works without knowing the details of what's going on in the brain. Just like I know how Microsoft Word works without knowing about the transistors or whatever. So the cognitive psychologists study the kinds of thinking that you can easily imagine a computer doing. So reasoning, memory, language, those kinds of things. And I'll make a brief point too that I think the cognitive psychologists got the philosophy of science right as well. So the behaviorists said that you should only study behavior, right? Only study what you can directly observe. They were sort of extreme empiricists. But in science, it's often the case that you have to invoke things that you cannot directly observe. So as an example, there are theories in physics about how the sun works, right? What's going on inside the sun. No one's ever been there, no one's ever going. You can't directly observe nuclear fusion in the sun. It's a theory about something that you can't see. But the theory of how fusion works leads to predictions about what you should observe. So it's testable. In the same way, you can't directly observe someone's thoughts or emotions, but it's okay to include those in a scientific theory as long as the theory leads to predictions about what you should observe. So the behaviorists, I think, took empiricism too far, saying you can't even theorize about things you can't observe. I don't think that's right, and the cognitive revolution kind of moved us away from that sort of extreme empiricism. Okay. Any questions about the cognitive perspective? Okay. One thing that's mentioned alongside the cognitive revolution, or as kind of an early precursor to it, that I'll briefly mention is Gestalt psychology. This is less important, but I'll say a bit about them. the Gestalt psychologists studied perception, so especially visual perception. So have a look at this. How many of you see a triangle? Right, me too. The problem is there's no triangle, right? All there is 3 circles with little chunks cut out of them. But the Gestalt psychologists notice that we tend to put things into patterns or groups. We are pattern-seeking animals. The way in which we process incoming perceptual information is we like to kind of group it together. One kind of quote that's famous from, or kind of a saying among the Gestalt psychologists, is the whole, W-H-O-L-E, not like the hole in the ground, but like the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. So the sum of the parts here is just circle with a chunk out of it, circle with a chunk out of it, and so on. But you put them together, you see something else. You see something, you see a pattern. So that's another kind of something that's related to the cognitive perspective that you should know. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Let's see what we can do. Yeah, we'll probably have time to just talk about the sociocultural perspective and maybe a little bit into behavioral genetics, but probably not even that. So, the sociocultural perspective. Yeah, this is probably the last thing we'll have time for. So, as you might be able to infer, there's 2 parts to this. So socio, meaning social, right, human interaction, and cultural. So this perspective emphasizes the ways in which other people shape us. People we know, people we interact with, and our wider culture. Let's do a quick little activity, maybe like a minute or 2. I want you all, either on your notepad or computer, to write out a few statements, as many as you can in the minute or 2 that I'm going to give you. All of the statements should begin with the words I am. And they should all be true. Don't make shit up. Statements that are true about you that begin with the words I am. I'll give you a minute or 2 just to write out as many as you can. Okay, how many of you have more than 4? Okay, good. I'll go ahead and stop there. So here's what I want you to quickly do. Look through them and see how many of them are relational in some way. So some of them will be things like I am, or some of you might have none of these, but things like I am a sister, I am an employee at Starbucks, I am X nationality. Those are all about groups you belong to or relationships you have with someone else. But something like I am tall, I am happy, I am good at backgammon, I don't know, whatever the hell you wrote. Those would be just about you. So try and divide them into those 2. Ones that are about your relationship with other people and ones that are not. Okay, how many of you had more relational terms than non? How many of you had more non-relational terms? It's what I would have figured. It's more even than I would have thought, though. So this is a real test that's used, although I think they usually make people do 20 of them. So we're almost out of time, so I'll just quickly say that there are two types of cultures that, and please don't start packing up till I say, otherwise it's going to be hard for people to hear, but there are two types of cultures that sociocultural psychologists study. Individualistic cultures, where the focus is on individual uniqueness, and collectivistic cultures where your membership in a group identity is emphasized. So it's more about living up to your family's expectations, your cultural expectations, and so on, whereas here it's about being a special snowflake, being your unique self. So Western countries are usually more individualistic. The most individualistic culture in the world is the United States. East Asian cultures, South Asian culture, many African cultures are more collectivistic. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that test you guys just did. So in collectivistic cultures, people usually list more relational terms in that test. That's one example of how that works. Okay, so let's stop there. I will see you all on Tuesday.